All right, as folks return to their seats, we do want to make sure we give a fair hearing to another important topic and then leave time for our revenue discussions. So people we're walking, we're finding our seats. So hard to tear away. I know that was a lot of conversation before the break, so certainly understand. And let me just make one more quick point on the early childhood front, if I can get folks' attention real quick. Some great extended discussion during the break. I promised Anna Jo Haynes that I would make this point. I think it's a good one. We heard Sue talk about it a little bit, but you could hear the collective gasp in the room when the question was made whether or not those estimates of full-day kindergarten and early and 4-year-old preschool included construction costs that would be entailed for housing those students, which aren't yet there, and you could sense that in the room. The points were made, though, that may not need to be taken care of by additional capital construction. There's great partnerships between community providers and the districts, and so those that might have doubled that number in their head certainly look to programs like the Denver Preschool Program and many private partnerships around the state, which are finding ways to use existing resources quite efficiently. So thanks for making that great point, Anna Jo. We'll move now, and I'll pass the mic to Mike. Where did he go? Under the header of the innovation design principle from the School Finance Partnership, and we'll get to hear a case study of how that might work.
Thank you all. Wonderful conversation so far today, and it's turned out to segue perfectly to this next section, which is in the original School Finance Partnership, we had a section of the document where a number of the stakeholders said it would be great if we had a pool of new revenue, not taking out of the existing formula, but of new revenue at some point to support innovative practices across the state. So if we have districts or schools who would really like to try some sort of innovation that they can't find the dollars to fund within their current formula, it would be great if we had some sort of innovation fund to help support that and scale that. And it was essentially that broad. We hadn't committed to what practices it would support or to how districts would use it or to what kind of priorities there would be. It was just that idea that first, let's get us to some sort of adequacy base. If we had dollars above that, it'd be great if we could support innovation. One of the things that I've heard so much of as I've talked to more superintendents and school leaders across the state, and actually you heard it echoed 3 or 4 times today. From George, from Glenn, about the point that Glenn's a very powerful statement about what we know we need is more time. And so one of the things we've heard from more and more districts is what we'd love to have, what would be at the top of our innovation list, would be the ability to fund more time, be it extended school years, extended school days. And so fittingly was back in Mapleton visiting with Charlotte last week, and Mapleton, which I think we would all consider one of the most innovative districts in the state in the last decade, and I was asking her what her big new idea was, and she was talking about just that. The top priority for them right now is around how to find more contact time with kids. And they just put together a Race to the Top proposal to do that, and so I thought they'd be a perfect candidate to come and talk to us about what could be one very significant form of innovation, which would be the innovation of additional time. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, in our usual conversations, Michael and I are often not on the same page. And that was, I thought there'd be like 10 people in here and we were just going to have a conversation. Obviously, that's not it. So I feel a little bit humbled, actually, that this is not really innovative at all. That thinking about an extended calendar really is not innovative. It would get us actually to where the rest of the country is at about 185 days for student contact during the year. But let me tell you just a little bit about what we're thinking. This is Mapleton's demographic, and this is our new demographic data as of October 1, so it's not been verified, but I'm pretty confident that this is right. This includes our children who are only the bricks and mortar kids, the kids who actually live in our community, not including the online contract school that we have. There are about 1,500 kids in that online contract school, and so that really distorts our demographic, but these are the kids who live in Mapleton. We want to make sure we're focusing on the kids who live in Mapleton for this particular conversation because context matters. Where your kids are, who your kids are, what the demographics of your own communities look like matters. So it wouldn't make sense that this would be an approach for every single school district across Colorado, but this is what makes sense in our school district in Colorado. So you can see that our poverty rate is pretty significant, with 79% of our students with free and reduced lunch, and the majority of them, significant majority, is free lunch. This has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. Since we started doing this work, we had 38% poverty 10 years ago. So just knowing that is kind of our basis. We'll look at what research has told us for a very long time. You'll see a study up there from 1996, and those studies continue. That really that gap, that 12 to 15 weeks that kids are out of school in the summer, creates a pretty significant learning loss. Now, in researching the effects in Mapleton, there would be two things that would close the learning gap between the kids who live in our community and the kids in higher communities, higher performing communities. The first one, 1/3 of our learning gap comes from the lack of early childhood programming. So we could close 1/3 of the gap with early childhood for all of our kids. 2/3 of the gap comes from the learning loss, which is a cumulative effect year after year. So reducing the amount of time that kids are out of school would have significant effect on student learning. So these are just some of the studies that we can cite, and we've got copies if anybody wants. Some of these we have with us. Yeah, I think we maybe have 10, because that's what I thought, how many people would be here, but we can certainly get you copies if you'd like them. So really for us, by extending the calendar and thinking differently about when kids are with us and how long those gaps of time is when they're away from us, we intend to disrupt and interrupt the cycle that really is what happens with children in poverty, where there's a community of poverty, they have extended time off, 12 to 15 weeks in many of our communities. They have low experiential exposure during the summer. Now that's not true in community of means. You'll see actually kids' gains go up, they gain during the summer because of the experiences they have in the summer. But for children of poverty, we see a dramatic difference in what happens to them when they're off. That summer regression creates more learning gaps, it's cumulative, and the cycle continues. A student-centered calendar is what we're calling it, because we're really trying to focus on what do our kids need. We're not talking year-round, we're not talking 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We are talking having 4 different time blocks, shorter breaks off, so 2 weeks off in the fall, 3 weeks off in the winter, 2 weeks off in the spring, and at maximum 5 weeks off in the summertime. What that does for us too, I don't know if any of you with also serving those communities of poverty, we see that every August is like waking the sleeping giant. And it takes us 6 weeks in some cases to get kids on track, to be learning again. So we've not only had them away from us for 12 to 15 weeks, and now it's taking us another 6 weeks to get them on track. So this kind of shortened amount of time would prevent the waking of the sleeping giant. We wouldn't be able to fall asleep. It would also give us opportunity for in those intercessions, for families who really needed the additional support, to provide additional opportunities for the 2 weeks, and the 5 weeks, to give kids those extended experiences, those enrichment experiences, not the remediation, not the things that make kids feel demeaned or less than others, but that they really do get to go to the zoo and fun things too in the summertime. So these are the real components that it would do for us. It adds 20 days to our student contact. It adds 22 days, I think, to our teaching staff. It'll take us from 186 to 210. 210 is about, I'd like to get to 220, but I think 210 will be pushing my luck. So getting to 210 at that point, it really gives us those intercessions, as I said. It would cost, and I think this is almost shocking, but $800 per kid gives us the whole agenda. It helps us fill the gaps with those intercessions, and it gives us all the extra transportation, the professional development, the data analysis, all those things at $800 a kid. Our negative factor takes $1,200 a kid from Mapleton. So just the negative factor, getting rid of that, would allow us to be able to do the kinds of things we really need to do now and focus on kids. Some of the additional benefits, obviously it gives us more time to really think about who these kids are, what we need to do. I think we could eliminate some of the things we're currently spending money on, like remediation and like having to have kids repeat classes and repeat grades. If we get ahead of it, we might be able to save some money on that end. So this doesn't calculate in any savings that we probably could generate, but really trying to go in it with what's the worst case scenario, what's the most expensive option that we have at this point. It's that just-in-time professional development for teaching staff. It's not waiting until August for those 4 days, but when they all get back, then we cram everything into them and expect them to implement it in September. So it would avoid some of that. It gives us more opportunity through the course of the year. So those are, even we offer free breakfast and lunch throughout the year because our population allows us to be able to do that, but not all our kids are available to access those nutrition programs. So having them in school throughout the summer and in a more regular basis would also allow us to assure that the kids are eating appropriately and have the nutritional benefits of being in school. Self-care is one of them we looked at in the research. Talks about how so many of the kids during the summer really are responsible for themselves and for their siblings, right? So there's not an adult necessarily in all of the homes watching the children who are home. It's a dependency on this self-care. Having them with us, obviously, turns that around and really gives kids the support that they need in order to achieve. So that's really good. We tried to cram it in really quick. It was all going really fast, but we wanted to just give you an idea of what we're thinking about. And again, it's not really innovative. It really is what we need to be doing. But we've got to make a commitment to invest in our kids. Got to make a commitment to spend the dollars where we need them. One of the questions that I've already been asked is, well, what about your teachers union? Would they buy into extending their calendar? Those of you who know Mapleton know that we have a partnership, a real partnership with our teaching union. And they have already been in these conversations. They, in fact, brought to our attention that having these kids away from us 12 to 15 weeks every year is ridiculous. And we've got to figure out a way to close that timeline. So yes, they are on board with it. Yes, some of them won't like it. And yes, some of them will leave. That's what change causes. But for the majority of our staff and the majority of the teachers working in Mapleton are very committed to figuring out whatever it's going to take. And it would help us pay them what they, get a per diem and we can improve that. That would actually be a bonus all in of itself. We have already spoken with our parent groups and with our student groups, and they too are very excited about it. I meet every month with a group of students, they're junior and seniors from all of our high schools. So I meet about 24 kids once a month. And in our last meeting last Friday, I asked the kids about this calendar. What do you think about an extended calendar that would make you go to school more? And they were really very, very appropriate in saying, really, Ms. Jonjo, having the kids home all summer is not good for them. And as we get ready to go into college, we are not as prepared as we probably need to be. And we got to step it up. So I thought it was impressive that obviously these are 24 handpicked kids from the schools, but they all acknowledge and recognize that this has to happen if we're going to close the gap between Mapleton's kids and the kids in higher performing school districts. That's really all we have.
School Finance Partnership, just to restate what Mike said, didn't make recommendations on this particular factor, but this is an example of how innovation funds could be used. So. All right. Thank you. Great. And thanks for helping out with our time crunch, too. Appreciate your brevity and succinctness. So I'm going to invite Chris Swatney back up to kind of kick off the long-awaited revenue conversation, our fearless and intrepid leader throughout the School Finance Partnership work.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks all for being here. I can't believe the size and scope, as I did throughout the School Finance Partnership, the scope of participation in really long meetings on really tough subjects. And I think what it continues to tell me, and I hope tell all of you, is that this is the right question to be answering. And as Senator Johnston said when we started this phase of the process, doing nothing is not an option. And so I just kind of wanted to say today, as we launch into the revenue part of this conversation, that this is not a discussion about if new revenue or should we think about revenue. We have to think about revenue. And it is certainly something we have built this process off, the recommendations of the partnership, And it is something the partnership said was a must. It was a package between the reforms and the things we need to do in schools and the new revenue to do them. So as we go into this half of the meeting, I just want us to think about how we're going to be innovative, how we're here, but I don't think that we think best. This is the therapist in me. We don't think best when we're anxious, right? We start thinking about, like, how do I protect what I've got? What's going to happen to my membership? And I just want us to go into this half of the meeting letting go of that and saying, we know we've got to do something, and it's going to be part of this package, and what's it going to look like, and how are we going to do it well, and what are we going to do that's going to be smart with new resources. So I just wanted to sort of set that tone here. The other thing I wanted to say about our first part of our conversation today, the early childhood stuff, is that those of you who participated in the partnership, we had a meeting that we focused on early childhood. And so a lot of the people that spoke up today, which I was glad to hear them today here and weighing in and talking about the return on investment, a lot of those conversations happened during the partnership. And if you'll recall, if you were there, and for those of you who weren't, early childhood was the one thing, you know, we have those little clicker polls that look like garage door openers. That was the one subject when we did the clicker poll. And I mean, usually like someone would disagree for something, right? You know, you'd say like, is it Tuesday? And like 17% of respondents would say like maybe. And so ECE comes up and we have this great conversation about early childhood, and we go to the, you know, polling says, and it was 100% support for the fact that we need to invest in early childhood as part of this system so that it is a streamlined system. It's not something separate. It's not something we think about later. It's not, if we can get the rest taken care of, then we'll add that on. 100% of respondents said this is one of the most important things we can do and we have to do it. And so I really wanted to bring that back again to this room also. We're really here talking about how are we going to do it? How are we going to do it well? How much can we do this? Are there smarter ways to find the resources that we can, how can we get there? But I just want to say that that said a lot to me about where this community is and how important we know those investments are. So I thank you again for your time today, for being here, and I look forward to this important part of the package, the revenue part. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so let's get to that conversation. And if you turn to the last page in your packets that you got when you came in, and this is kind of an overflow crowd. So if you didn't get one, we will try to hurry around and give you at least some note paper to write on. But so if you don't have one, maybe you can look off your neighbors. There's a couple of different ways you can have a conversation about revenue. One is trying to figure out what the actual costs would be. We've had a number of those throughout the conversation. We had Todd kind of estimating today. It's a very difficult and technical way into that conversation, and one that takes a fair amount of data and kind of number crunching. That isn't the way we're going to come into the conversation today. What we wanted to get a sense was of two factors in that conversation. So whatever the costs, the real costs of a fully funded program might be, we can at least ask in the revenue conversation, where would those dollars best come from? And assuming that we might not have an infinite amount of them, and you had to kind of prioritize where you would apply them to get your input on that. That may mean that all of your priorities could get funded to a certain degree, but it's incredibly helpful to get a sense from the room, assuming dollars come into the coffers and need to be prioritized at how they're applied, to get your thoughts on that. So let's walk through the two circles you see here. The top one is just the kind of mechanisms that are available for raising those dollars, and we'll look at a few of those. And for those that are not necessarily financial experts, these may not have great distinctions between them, but hopefully at your tables as we ask you to talk in discussions, you can think through of the different ways people might be willing to kind of make sense out of generating new revenue. Which ones seem to make some sense? Which ones are more fair? Which ones might generate the most support? Those might be some of the factors you consider. Reinstating graduated income taxes, extending sales taxes, doubling excise taxes on certain goods. There might be a number of mechanisms you think could best kind of appeal to the voters of Colorado as sources of revenue. The second question is, let's assume you've garnered those resources and are now applying them to the ideal educational system in Colorado. To prioritize those categories that are listed there as maybe the first dollars in sequence that you would refund all the way. or kind of it's a relative sense of your priorities of the funding. It doesn't mean that we can always distinguish between the difference between a 4 and a 5, but as best you can, that gives the School Finance Partnership some relative prioritization to work with in synthesizing today's input. So I want you to turn to the partners at your table, take on both of those two discussions. Yes, and quick question.
This is the most important part of the conversation, and we've got half an hour for it. And maybe I'm the only one thinking this, so I apologize if I sound rude or crass, but it seems like we need a much more in-depth conversation than a half an hour's worth of looking at these two options. And I know there were some suggestions on the website, and I'm not faced, people, I'm happy to have this conversation, but I'd like to understand that maybe we'll get together as a group again, knowing the School Finance Partnership spent almost 2 years, a year and a half on this, so we can have an in-depth discussion.
I think the answer is unequivocally yes, there will be a follow-up meeting too. And I'm open to ideas about another way to start it other than just if you're essentially asking the room to stay longer or...
No, I'm not. I'm just saying it's 4:30 and
Yeah.
we're just now getting the revenue. And I'm just talking to people as I walk around, I know a lot of people feel like this is the most important conversation of the TAG group. And we've left a half an hour for it. And we've spent hours on other stuff. So I think it deserves more than a half an hour.
Okay.
That's all I'm going on record as saying.
No, I think that's a great point. I don't think the thought is that this is the only time available for it, but is there, maybe to pose this question, is there a different way to get into the conversation, knowing it'll last beyond the half hour we have? Is this an entry point people can take to at least begin it? And then we'll find as much additional time, both online and in person, as we can. Yes, Tracy?
I think that everybody's perception of how you would have a conversation about graduated income tax or something like that is going to be based on their own perception, and not necessarily on a wide range of knowledge and spectrum. So I think it's not as genuine a conversation to think that the results you get from this are going to be a great direction.
So I have a concern on that. I also look at thinking about, are we talking about this as a one-year plan? Is this a multi-year plan? What are things that are currently that the legislature can do? What are things that are beyond the legislature and have to go to the public? So I look at this as a very, I don't know what you're going to do with the knowledge once you have this information.
Good caution. If we don't know that much about the meanings of each one of these, how come let's not give too much weight to the input on it.
I mean, what I might think of is might be different than Carol.
I admit that I spend my entire professional career looking at questions of tax and budget, so I have to share Paula's concern that 30 minutes might not be quite sufficient, but I'd like to take up the challenge of another way to enter the conversation. It seems to me that the most important part of what we can sort of, I don't think, it's going to be tough to do in 30 minutes too, but to me, I'd say we punt, quite frankly, on the revenue piece for now. We set another meeting to talk about that, and we bring the same kinds of expertise to the front of the room to talk about relative advantages and disadvantages of different taxing structures, what those things may mean, how much money they can raise, how they're going to affect the very same families that are going to be impacted by low-income weights at changes. But we focus for this group on this question of priorities for new money. The thing I've taken away, and I did miss last time's meeting, but I've been to every other one of them, and I come away with it is there's a huge number of priorities. And that we have yet to talk about a topic where anybody said, oh, well, that's easy, we could save a bunch of money there. And it seems to me that my strong advice, because of the sense of frustration that I feel if we get into this question of what we do about money in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I think it may be a goodwill challenge. I would suggest we focus the next 20 minutes on this question of priority, put a stake in the ground for a longer conversation that gives us the same level of expertise and understanding on the revenue questions that we have invested on higher ed or on special ed, preschool, et cetera.
Seem to be a lot of heads nodding to that one. There's a hand in the back.
I agree that it's going to take more than a half an hour, but the purpose that I came today was to try to see what types of new revenue opportunities there might be. I struggle with the idea that the form has already split into what would our revenues be and how would we prioritize the expenditures immediately. I think that if we spend our time trying to identify more than the 7 revenue opportunities that are listed here, we might give this group more opportunity to look at, are there other opportunities other than these 7 that are in place?
All right. And I'm also noticing that as we talk about how much time we don't have to have the conversation, we may not have the conversation also. Let me turn to Senator Johnston. I want to offer an alternative model here.
So I just want to clarify 2 things that I should have been clear about before, which are 2 things that we are not going to solve in this process. Which is, the one is, there has been an ongoing conversation about how much money is enough. Right? What is the adequacy decision about how much money it takes to fund K-12 system? There is work underway on that. We have different groups that have different estimates on what they think that right number is, and we know there's work being done to update even the Lobato number, and so that work is underway. We will have that as one data point. That was not part of the charge there today or this session, was for us to figure that out. Also not part of the charge today or this session was us to figure out what the right mechanism was by which to raise revenue, right? Which is to say, part of this working group structure is, what do we think the needs are and what are the priorities? And then we're going to take those priorities and sit down with folks who have done a tremendous amount of thinking, many of them in this room, on what the right ways to raise revenue are on, and then on how you raise that revenue. So, and then the last part I'll add is that this group also committed from the beginning. The biggest criticism we got early is, we don't want to do this dance again for nothing. Because we don't want to have this conversation for 6 months or 9 months, and either have people decide not to go for any money, or we don't want to do this for 6 months or 9 months and have folks bust their behinds for a year and a half and not get any money at the end of it. Which is to say, we are also a pragmatic, solution-oriented group driven towards what is the right amount of revenue that we think we can obtain, and how can we obtain it. And so I will say that Carol's exactly right. I think the goal today is about priorities among all of the needs that we have, and then our final session is about what are the potential ways to access that revenue, and frankly, what do we think the voters' threshold is for what amount of revenue. So there will always, I can guarantee you today, be a discrepancy between what folks think we ought to have versus what the voters will actually approve. Right? And so for me, there's no benefit to us agreeing that we should have $10 billion and going to the ballot and losing 90 to 10. Right? And so I think there's a question both of, and I think also that's going to link to my closing statement, which is, I also think how broad this coalition is, and how many of the things that some folks in this room may not want to approach, but will extend the coalition of folks who believe we're improving the effectiveness of the system, will depend on how much money we have to spend. Will also depend on how big your campaign is, which will depend on how much you can pass. So those things are all linked together. And I want to be clear, I want to be upfront, I want to be pragmatic about the reality of that. But our hope in the next 30 minutes is what Carol described, which is, given the fact that there's so much to be done, what are our priorities among those categories in some first sketch, knowing that we'll come back again a final time to look at what are the ways you do that, and what are the limitations on what's possible to do.
I think that is in sequence with my proposal would be that we do dive into it. Knowing that this conversation could last a long time, we'll find more time for it, but to at least begin it today and get your thoughts on that prioritization question in particular. We will take last comment here from Kathy and try to dive into it.
I just have one question, and that is, are we ever going to talk about facilities, or are we only looking at operations when we're talking about the priorities? Are we going to ever talk about facilities when we talk about priorities, or are we just talking operations? It was a question I posted on the website, and I never got an answer to it.
We have not broached facilities yet, and have not planned to. We would assume that to be a set. And I've talked to Senator Schwartz and some others who are working on what is the long-term solution to the current best proposal and feasibility for. Sorry. Short answer is no, this project is not meant to capture facilities. There is separate parallel legislation and process going on around BEST and the improvement in the long-term stability of BEST. But I think you know as well as anyone that the capital construction costs, in addition to the operational costs, would quickly outrun our current capacity to fund operations. And so I think that has to be a separate revenue source and probably a separate a separate statutory conversation. But is one that's already underway and that you all have been involved in and others have. But I think that will be a separate process from this one.
All right, so from that initial knot in the stomach, like, what? Is it only 30 minutes? Hopefully you can kind of ease that at your tables, at least give it a first cut. If the top circle is just kind of out of the stratosphere for you, looking at that is not taking anywhere in a productive way, please don't feel like you have to cover that. If you are drawn to that and feel like there's important questions that you want to help preview the kinds of additional information this group could use, please by all means go after it. But don't leave the question of prioritization untouched. If you could go around at your tables as best you can, talk about what you've heard in some of these meetings, where would you begin, what input would you offer out of all the different kind of opportunities we've listed there, and do keep in mind there's an other there too if those don't capture the full range of it. So again, I would encourage you to go around your table, give each person a chance to have their say, and we'd love to collect these by the end. And please start with Paula at this table. I'll feel much better. Much better. All right, thanks. So sorry to pull you back from the groups, but we will just spend these last few minutes. Oh, it's sparked a robust conversation quite obviously. So if I could ask you to pull back to a large group. We've just got a few minutes left for some closing thoughts. As we have done in each meeting, we'll pass around some comment cards and some dots to demonstrate that you've been here as part of this discussion. But if I could just request your attention up here, then we'll get some final comments. So Tracy's looking at me earnestly. Thank you. So two process points that I'll turn it over to Senator Johnston for his round of closing remarks. I feel like that kid that went up to one of those little bins in a candy store with a tiny little bag and opened it and the whole bin came down. So just a couple of mea culpas on that. In trying to imagine what this conversation would be like, knowing all the topics we had, we perhaps naively thought a thin gloss of some feedback on the mechanisms, a first cut at prioritization would give us a chance to come back in our final meeting, as we've done, is kind of sharing back. Here's what we think we've heard. Here's some more attention to these conversations. Here's how it all fits together. Clearly, there's a deep hunger for a much more substantive and longer conversation. So rest assured that will be factored into the scheduling of our final meeting. You'll note we've never put a date or an agenda on that, largely anticipating we didn't know where we'd be at this point. I think we got some good clarity on some things that are top of mind. And so we'll hope you'll come back for kind of what was initially meant to be a synthesis of everything we've heard in all of the meetings. And I think we'll need to leave a little bit more space for a continued aspect of this revenue conversation, clearly. And I'll let Senator Johnston speak to that. And I'm looking at Hannah to see if we have the comment cards. Are those out on the tables or coming around for the final thing? So Hannah will be passing those around. It's been incredibly helpful to get your feedback. We would love to keep your sheet that you use to prioritize those. And if you could put your name on it, that would be even better, so we could follow up if there's handwriting questions or ideas that were generated that are great. So thanks for your goodwill and patience on diving into a conversation that clearly needs more time and starting it off so well today. Let me pass it to Senator Johnston.
Thank you so much. This was our data point on the value of real-time feedback, which is how you adjust instruction mid-course. So to Bill's point, yes. So our goal was there were some great conversations on the tables on how people would prioritize what they see as the most important revenue streams and where to do that. I think one thing that is clearly true is that it would be great to add Carol's suggestion of actually a much deeper understanding of what are the potential revenue sources from which those come, what are the potential impacts on populations that we care about given the progressiveness or regressiveness of those sources. And this was why at the very beginning we left two reasons why we left the final meeting with no agenda and why we had revenue as the final agenda item, because we assumed this would take a 2-meeting process, and our goal was to figure out what kind of feedback we got from today and what we needed specifically for the last session. And again, our thought was it would be more specifics about putting pieces together. I think now really good feedback that we have a sense of priorities, we have a sense of some versions of the costs, and I know there's significant disagreement about how you go about deciding that, to some of these items as we propose them. But what will be needed is, I think, the other balance of some real substantive new content about what the options are for how to raise them and from where to raise them. I don't presume that we will solve that question that day, but I do presume that we'll have at least a full overview of what the options are in that way. And so what we will try to do, and I know it gets into a hard time of the year heading into the holidays, but we will try to do is get on everyone's calendar for one final meeting, which would probably be, I imagine, at late November, early December, to try to come back and work on bringing some folks from this room to do a longer substantive proposal around the revenue options in terms of generation and impact, and then leave some time still for wrap-up of concepts and trying to put different puzzle pieces together into one mosaic. So I think that leaves us about at the end. So thank you. Bill, anything else we need to wrap up?
I think just
Make sure you get your final dot. Apparently there's an election tomorrow, so make sure you vote if you haven't yet. And that will help us hopefully solve school finance over the next year or so. So thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see